All right, folks, welcome to episode 4 of Spiritual Formation for the Family. We are in week 4 of our generosity practice. I'm only going to do this 2 more times until maybe we roll it back with practicingtheway.org. But this is a curriculum that we have taken from a website called practicingtheway.org, primarily led by John Mark Comer. Big fan of his. I think that they're doing some excellent stuff over there at Practicing the Way. And so they offer all this stuff for free. But this is just something that we saw at our church, like, hey, generosity is something that we need to address. We have a very generous church in lots of ways, but then we also need to address it in its more complete way, understanding that generosity with our finances likely will lead to generosity with our schedules, and generosity with our schedules will likely lead to more generosity with our relationships, and relationships to schedules, and schedules to money. And like these 3 things, they're just so interconnected and interwoven that we can't really separate them into their own space. If you are a Christian, God has given you the responsibility of stewarding your finances, your schedule, and your relationships. And really, outside of those 3 things, you don't have anything else to steward. That's kind of the crazy thing about it. Now, each one of those categories has a slew of webs that kind of break off from there, or I guess branches would be a way to talk about that. But they're all very connected, and so when we find ourselves being generous in one area, we're going to find bleed over in other areas. When we find ourselves being good stewards in one area, we're going to find ourselves being good stewards in other areas. So we only have this session and then one more session left in our generosity practice. Today we're going to be in Luke chapter 12, and then we're going to go over to Acts chapter 2. So I want to just go ahead and launch into Luke chapter 12. We're going to be in verses... We're going to start at verse 13, and we may stop along the way, but all of this is kind of connected. So we have a parable in verses 13 through 21, and this is how it reads. Someone in the crowd said to him, "Teacher, tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me." But he said to him, Man, who made me a judge or arbitrator over you? And he said to them, Take care and be on your guard against all covetousness, for one's life does not consist in the abundance of his possessions. And he told them a parable, saying, The land of a rich man produced plentifully. And he thought to himself, What shall I do? For I have nowhere to store my crops. And he said, I will do this. I will tear down my barns and build larger ones, and there I will store all my grain and my goods. And I will say to my soul, Soul, you have ample goods laid up for many years. Relax, eat, drink, be merry. But God said to him, Fool, this night your soul is required of you, and the things you have prepared, whose will they be? So is the one who lays up treasure for himself and is not rich toward God. Okay, let's talk about the parable really quickly. You've got these 2 real people coming to Jesus, telling him, hey, my brother's not giving me this inheritance that I want. Tell him to split that. Tell him to split that with me. And let me tell you something. I have seen in my own family and in many, many other families I'm talking about very good people. I have a great family. But the minute you start talking about inheritance, things get real interesting really quickly. The minute you start talking about inheritance, people will start raising their eyebrows and thinking, hey, what's my name got underneath it? What is my piece of this pie right here? And as a result of that, we can find ourselves kind of side-eyeing our family and thinking, you know what, they don't have my best interest in mind, or maybe they're taking too much. And Jesus just is like, well, let's back this truck up just a little bit, and then tells them this story about a guy who just stored up all this stuff for himself here on this earth. I mean, like just storehouses and storehouses, to the point that he realized, like, you know what, my barns are not big enough for the stuff that I have. So I'm going to tear down the old barns. I'm going to build new ones, and then I'm going to have enough stuff, or I'm going to have enough room for all my stuff. And Jesus just basically goes to the guy, or God goes to the guy in the story and it's like, hey, you know, you did all this stuff to build up your own personal wealth and your own personal comfort, but now your soul is required of you. It is time for you to die, and none of this stuff can be taken from this life here on earth to the age to come. And so then Jesus goes on, and then he says, like very clearly in verse 21, he says, so is the one who lays up treasures for himself and is not rich toward God. So there, the point of the parable is very simple. Be rich towards God. You cannot take anything in this life with you into the age to come, but you can walk into the age to come far more virtuous than you entered into this life. And that's completely dependent upon you and your willingness to submit to God, your finances, your schedule, and your relationships. And so then we get this beautiful dialogue from Jesus starting in verse 22. And he said to his disciples, "Therefore I tell you, do not be anxious about your life, what you will eat, nor about your body, what you will put on. For life is more than food, and the body more than clothing. Consider the ravens. They neither sow nor reap. They have neither storehouse nor barn, and yet God feeds them. Of how much more value are you than the birds? And which of you, by being anxious, can add a single hour to his span of life? If then you are not able to do as small a thing as that, why are you anxious about the rest? Consider the lilies, how they grow. They neither toil nor spin. Yet I tell you, even Solomon in all of his glory was not arrayed like one of these. But if God so clothes the grass which is alive in the field today and tomorrow is thrown into the oven, how much more will he clothe you, O you of little faith? And do not seek what you are to eat and what you are to drink, nor be worried, for all the nations of the world seek after these things, and your Father knows that you need them. Instead, seek his kingdom, and these things will be added to you. Fear not, little flock, for it is your Father." I'm just going to pause right there for a second. I love "fear not, little flock." There's something about being called little flock there that I don't know. There was at one point in my life that I probably wouldn't have appreciated that very much. I just really appreciate that description at this point in time. "Fear not, little flock, for it is your Father's good pleasure to give you the kingdom. Sell your possessions and give to the needy. Provide yourselves with money bags that do not grow old, with a treasure in the heavens that does not fail, where no thief approaches and no moth destroys. For where your treasure is, there will your heart be also." Now, that last part, that probably... your mind probably recalls our passage from a couple of weeks ago where we essentially have a parallel passage here in the book of Luke. But I want us to compare and contrast the way that this dialogue started, in which Jesus is talking to these brothers and they're arguing about their inheritance. Then he moves to his parable describing this rich guy. And I really want us to focus in on a modern day parallel that completely steps on my toes and probably should step on the toes of all of us listening to this. I'm sure that there's some of us who are not, maybe not all of us. So I'm sure there's some of us who are doing really well in this area, but I think as Americans, we got to really hone in on this. If we were to take this same parable and just update it, right? Like how many of us are like, "Oh man, I need more barn space for my grain and more stable space for my flocks and things like that." Like that's not really the modern. There are some people. I think of one of my buddies, Jory, who has a massive farm out in West Texas, and he probably needs more like literal barns. But many of us, as we are thinking about what we need more of and stuff, it's not barns, but maybe it's something like a really healthy 401k. And then we can maybe go on there. Maybe we need that 6-month security blanket that so many Christian leaders talk about, that like, hey, you've got to have this much in savings, cash, just in case something happens. And some people even stretch that on out to a year. Maybe it's not that. Maybe it's, hey, you got to have this house that you can grow old in, and it's got all the things that you can possibly think of. Or maybe you need this car because this car is going to be the thing that gives you that extra level of comfort. Because that's essentially what this rich person is talking about. He's like, hey, I've got everything that I need. Now I just need more. Why? Well, it's just a little bit more comfort. It's a little bit more space that I can store my stuff in that just gives me a little bit more cushion, a little bit more comfort, just in case the hard times ever hit. And so essentially, like we as Americans, we understand this rich man in this parable very well. Why? Because this is the American dream. Like everything that I just read in Luke chapter 12, verses 13 through 21 in the parable, Jesus is 2,000 years ago, before America was even dreamt of, Jesus is spelling out the American dream and saying, whoa, 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 this is foolish. Someday our soul is going to, our soul is going to leave this age to enter into the age to come. And once that happens, all of the comforts and all of the stuff that we build up for safety, for pleasure, for greed, whatever the case may be, all that stuff we built up, it's going to stay here. And we can say, oh, well, you know what? Like, it's going to go to our children. We don't know that. There's certain thing as an inheritance tax. There's other factors that go into that. Our children may squander all this stuff and be left destitute at the end of their life. And so Jesus just says, no, like, don't lay up treasure here. Don't worry about it. You just need what you need and you don't need anything else. Now, that's not Jesus' words. I just came up with that on the spot. That's pretty impressive, I will say. So somebody might have to tweet that later. I don't even think I can remember what it was. What was it, Al? I lost it. There it is. Listening. Fair enough. So Jesus' word is, hey, be rich toward God. And then he just goes on telling his little flock. He's like, hey, you don't have to worry about anything. Like, we don't have to worry about anything. We're going to be okay. God takes care of His creation, and He especially takes care of His children. And so then we get into okay, Jesus, please tell us. Because I think it's so interesting. People who struggle with anxiety, I have struggled with anxiety at times in my life, and it can be a really, it can just take all the life out of you. It never works for somebody who is struggling with anxiety to have somebody else come to them and say, hey, stop struggling with anxiety. Hey, you're dealing with blank thing. Well, just stop doing that. Like usually steps are necessary. That is the work of spiritual formation, taking those steps towards total and complete surrender. And oftentimes it takes a whole life or a very large portion of a life. And so Jesus gives us like the step. In verse 33, it's very clear. He says, sell your possessions and give to the needy. Provide yourselves with money bags that do not grow old, with a treasure in the heavens that does not fail, where no thief approaches and no moth destroys. Now, there's two parts to this. Number one, you have the money side of things, and that's where we're going to focus. On the other side, you have the spiritual formation, and that's kind of what this podcast is designed to do. It's just kind of designed to help families work through spiritual formation, so we'll have other episodes about that. But let's talk specifically about the money side of things. Jesus tells us not to fear. It is the Father's good pleasure to give you the kingdom. He says, sell your possessions and give to the needy. This is where things get interesting for us. We have had a few weeks now where the goal has been to discern what do we have and what do we need, and are those things in balance with each other, right? I mean, like we haven't described it in that way, but essentially that's kind of been the work of the last 3 weeks, is really trying to pray and discern and get to a place where we can adequately say, hey, here's what I have and here's what I need. They're on the same plane. They're parallel. They're working together here. They're equal. And the reality for many of us as American Christians is that we have significantly more than we need. And so what is Jesus' call? Jesus' call is not necessarily to sell everything. And here's why I'm going to say that. Some may say, well, Coby, didn't he tell the rich young ruler to sell everything? Yes, he did. He did tell the rich young ruler to sell everything, give it to the poor, and then come and follow him. However, in the very next chapter, he told Nicodemus he only needed to sell half or something like that. Later on in the book of Acts, you have Lydia, this seller of purple dyes. She was likely incredibly wealthy. To our knowledge, she doesn't necessarily sell anything that she owns, but rather she becomes this financial person for the church in Philippi to kind of help the church get started. And so she doesn't sell anything. She just becomes generous with what she has, allowing people in her home and so on and so forth. And so that's where last week was so important. Like, we have got to learn to listen to God's voice and understand exactly what it is that He wants for us. And when we understand what He wants for us, we can understand that, yeah, He may be calling some of us to sell everything that we have and maybe go to some mission field or something along those lines. Or maybe He's calling some of us to sell half of what we have and give it away. Maybe He's calling some of us to say, no, you know what? Don't sell anything that you have. Just start utilizing it for the kingdom of God. Like you have what you need. It's time for you to start utilizing it for God's kingdom. So we have to discern through that stuff. But once we start working through that discernment, we have to be able to say, okay, God, I hear what you're saying. I know what you want me to do. And now it's time for me to work. And oftentimes we just have to take step after step after step. And oftentimes those are little steps accompanied with the occasional big step. And then we find ourselves in this place where we have a generous heart. And so we have to become people who are kingdom-minded. And when Jesus came, He very vividly expressed the kind of people that He is looking out for. And who are those people? It's the poor and the needy. It is those people with needs. I want to read to what the curriculum defines as a poor person. It says, the poor are anyone who has need around you. Anyone who has need around you. Now, here's the crazy thing about this right here. We can't take care of all the poor people on the planet. Like you as an individual and your family, you can't take care of all the poor people on the planet. But you can take care of the poor people around you. And not only can you take care of the poor people around you, you can also take care of poor people abroad through some really cool ministries like Compassion International. Right? For like $50 a month, you can like sponsor a child and they will have food, water, education, clothing, and a home for $50 a month. That is insane because $50 a month will barely get you a Whataburger for your family in Jacksonville, Texas. And so one of the interesting things that we see with this particular definition of the poor that Practicing the Way describes is that our focus ought to be on those in proximity to us. But because of our digital age, that proximity may expand to global. But we'll get to that in just a second, all right? So let's start with like the proximity, like literally the location that we're in. So I want us to read really quickly Acts chapter 2, verses 42 through 47. Acts chapter 2, verses 42 through 47. So basically the church has just begun, all right? Pentecost has come, the Holy Spirit has come, spiritual gifts have come, things are really radical, and the church, this is like the church at its birth right here. And I want to describe to you what the early church looked like. It says, Acts chapter 2, 42 through 47, and they devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and the fellowship, to the breaking of bread and the prayers. And all came upon every soul, and many wonders and signs were being done through the apostles. And all who believed were together and had all things in common. Now let's focus on 44 right there. And all who believed were together and had all things in common. And they were selling their possessions and belongings and distributing the proceeds to all as any had need. And day by day, attending the temple together and breaking bread in their homes, they received their food with glad and generous hearts, praising God and having favor with all the people. And the Lord added to their number day by day those who were being saved. Okay, so let's just go ahead and say the quiet part out loud. This looks like socialism. Now, I know that here we are in a society that is divided over that term, socialism. We have some people that are like, hey, this is the political strategy that will take us into the prosperity that we need. And we have other people saying, no, this is of the devil. When we read Acts chapter 2, verses 42 through 47, and it says, and all came upon every soul, and many wonders and signs were being done through the apostles. And all who believed were together and had all things in common, and they were selling their possessions and belongings and distributing the proceeds to all as any had need. Okay, so what are we working with here in Acts chapter 2? Are we working with socialism? No. Why? Because socialism is a governmental construct in which the government, that may or may not have any Christian values whatsoever, is mandating that somebody earns this amount. Now it's time to take a portion of that amount and give it to somebody who doesn't own enough, and the distribution of wealth by governmental means. That's not what is being talked about here. There is no government entity involved in this whatsoever. Now here's what's even more crazy. Back in these times, 2,000 years ago, the government didn't get involved in helping the poor. The government did not get involved in helping with the needy. This is a new construct for governments around the world to actually feel like it is their responsibility to take care of their own poor and needy. Back 2,000 years ago, there was no government construct that was doing such a thing. There was the church. And the church had this beautiful understanding of what was needed and what was not. And they kept what was needed and got rid of everything else. So that way nobody in the church would have a need. And now, there's some nuance that we can approach this passage. I'm going to give you my best guess. But I could understand where somebody would disagree with what I'm about to say. But there definitely is some nuance in the passage. What we see here is that the early church took care of each other so ridiculously well that the outsiders were looking in saying, how do I get to be a part of that? Why are those people so radically generous with one another? Now, I will say that I do think that there was generosity given outside of the church too. I do think that just like these early Christians in general, they took care of each other really stinking well. And I do think that they took care of other people around them, the poor, the needy around them really, really well too. But I think that it kind of originated in this idea like, hey, who is around me? Who is my church family? Who are these Christians that are in need? Let me take care of them. Let me take care of my community so that nobody in my community, when I say community, I'm not necessarily talking about your town or city. I'm talking about your group of people that you do life with. Who in my community needs something, and how can I help with that need? And if that is their mentality, or if that was their mentality, it makes complete sense that they would then in turn attract people who are looking around saying, wow, nobody is like y'all. Nobody's taking care of the poor. Nobody's taking care of the needy. And yet here in y'all's family, in y'all's community of Christians, nobody is without. Everybody has what they need. That's an attractive kingdom. That's an attractive mindset that I think that we all have to be aware of. And so if I could just throw out a practical piece of advice, because I know like still the how is still present for us, right? And the how is, okay, Jesus, we get it. We don't need to worry. We don't need to have this fearful mindset about what we have and don't have and all this stuff like that. But how is it that I can become a more generous person? And I think that the first thing is that we just take care of those people around us. Start there. Yes, there are going to be people in Jacksonville, Texas, because this is a podcast primarily for Jacksonville, Texas. But if you're listening from abroad, there's going to be people in your community that need you. But if you're looking for a place to start, just start with the people that you do life with. Start with the community of Christians that you are around the most, and have that tough, awkward conversation with somebody and say, hey, do you have any needs? Now, here's the thing about that. Why is that a tough and awkward conversation? Because we make it that way. We are prideful, and we don't want people to know that we have needs. We don't want people to know that maybe we have squandered our stewardship of the things that God has given us, our time, our schedule, our schedule, our money, and our relationships. And so when somebody comes to you or me and they say, hey, do you have any needs? If I say yes, I'm now going to have to tell them why my answer is yes. And that is a very humbling thing. We need to be humble people. And we need to be okay with not being okay. And we need to be okay with confessing our failures in front of other people and saying, you know what? I made a really poor decision here. And as a result of that, yeah, we are hurting. And we do have some needs that if the church doesn't step in and meet, I don't know what we're going to do. We're going to have to make sacrifices, and those sacrifices are going to hurt our schedule, hurt our finances, hurt our relationships. And I think that if we are wise, and if we are humble, and if we approach these things with the kind of care that Christ calls us to have, the church can step up and make sure that nobody inside the church has any needs. But a need can't be met unless the need is first spoken. You know, one of the most generous things that somebody could do, this is kind of on a separate note, same note, but a slightly different way. One of the most generous things somebody can do is give the hard truth to an individual who says that they're in need. I had a guy that used to call me pretty often, and just like one of the first things he would say would be like, "Hey, how's your finances?" And he would always talk about mine and Courtney's finances and try to walk us through, wise practices for those things. And one of the things I can vividly remember is, in times where I'm like, man, things are a little tight right now. And he'd be like, okay, well, let's talk about your recent purchases. And I would have to tell him, well, I just bought this or I just bought that. And some of the most generous things that this individual spoke to me was a good and honest rebuke. And it wasn't done in meanness. It wasn't uncharitable. It was very kind. It was just like, you probably don't need that. Like, you can sell that and be out from that debt and be okay. If somebody comes and says, hey, yeah, I do have this great financial need, it's not at all unkind or ungenerous to say, hey, I would love to help meet your need. Do you mind if we sit and we talk about maybe your last 6 months of purchases and finances and things like that? And I know that sounds, maybe you're like, Coby, that sounds cultish or something, or that sounds like that is way too personal there. I don't think it's cultish. I think it's Christian. I think that we as Christians, like, we share our lives together, and if we can do so in humility, not forcing our thoughts on somebody else, but just like walking with people through their burdens and through their need, I think that the outside world at that point in time will be able to come alongside us and say, wow, what are you guys doing? We really we've got to be a part of this. All right, so take care of your church. Start there. Then move to that place where you're taking care of the needs of the community, the physical community around you. We have an impoverished community in Jacksonville, Texas. We have a lot of folks who are struggling financially. We can meet a lot of needs here. And so we need to think and focus our attention like, hey, let us do that so that way some missionary is not in Los Angeles right now thinking, okay, how can we get help to Jacksonville? No. Central Baptist Church is in Jacksonville. Other churches are in Jacksonville. This is our mission field. So let's take care of our mission field. Let's saturate it so much with the help that it needs so that way other outside groups are not necessary because we're taking care of our own. And then from there, I think that's when we can even look even beyond that. And so, we don't need to be dogmatic about this approach. I just think that there is potentially some wisdom here if you're wondering, okay, well, where do I start? Start with the people around you. Start with those close friends. Then branch out to your greater community. Then branch out from there and go so on and so forth. And I will say this, there's going to be some ministries like a Compassion International that it just makes sense. Like, I mean, you could probably do that even as you're trying to take care of the people that are around you, where it's just like, hey, $50 a month and I can take care of some kid in a foreign country that is incredibly impoverished. I can take care of their food, water, medical bills, all those things for $50 a month, sold. I'm there. So there are ministries like that we need to be open to. But the point of all this is really, really simple. Who do I know that has a need, and what do I have to give that can meet that need? And I just think that like those 3 steps, starting with the people who are closest to you, and then just kind of branching out from there, I think that's a way that we can walk in wisdom and help meet the needs of the people around us. So with that being said, we have one more session, and the next session is just going to be about some basic practices and just some wisdom, some collective wisdom of people that we can apply to our lives. So until then, this is Spiritual Formation for the Family, hosted by Central Baptist Church. We're glad that you tuned in with us. We'll talk to you soon.